Before we begin, this course is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, tax, investment, or professional advice of any kind. Nothing in this course is a recommendation to acquire, hold, or dispose of any digital asset. ETRUST Academy is not a regulated educational institution, and a certificate of attendance does not confer a professional or investment qualification. If your family needs advice specific to your circumstances, please consult a qualified solicitor, trustee, or financial advisor. Welcome to Digital Asset 101. My name is Dr. Matthew Au. My background sits at the intersection of technology, finance, and law, and for a while now, I've been applying that background to a genuinely new field, digital assets. I want to be upfront about something before we start. This isn't drawn from years of advising clients specifically on digital assets. Very few people anywhere can honestly claim that yet. What I have done is spend real time making sense of this asset class myself, the technical mechanics, the practical risks, and how it connects with fields I do know well, particularly law, regulation, and trust structures. This course is that process, shared with you as I go. Where I'm confident, I'll say so plainly. Where something is still genuinely unsettled, I'll say that too. Because this is a single, longer session rather than a series of short episodes, let me give you the map for where we're headed so you know the shape of the journey up front. So we'll start with the core idea, what a digital asset actually is, stripped of jargon and hype. From there, we go straight into the part I find most genuinely useful and closest to my own background, custody. Who actually controls a digital asset and what that means practically for you and your family. Right after that, we'll map the wider landscape, the different categories of digital assets you're likely to hear mentioned before bringing in the Hong Kong connection, how this regulatory environment treats each of them, and how a trust can and can't actually hold one, which is where my background in law and trust structures comes in most directly. Once we've covered that ground, we'll step back and look at why families end up holding these assets in the first place, usually without ever deciding to. And we'll close with a practical session on what to actually do with everything we've covered, the questions worth asking, the mistakes worth avoiding, what this session has deliberately left out, and where this fits alongside anything else you already know about trusts and succession planning. So, the core idea, custody. The landscape of types, the Hong Kong and trust connection, why families hold these assets, and finally, what to do with it all. Nothing in what follows is legal, financial, investment, or professional advice. It's an honest attempt to understand a new field, shared openly. Let's get started. Let's start with the core idea. Digital asset sounds technical, but the idea underneath it is actually old and very human. How do you prove that something belongs to you when there is no central authority, no bank, no land registry, no government keeping the official record? Traditionally, we solve this with institutions. Your bank keeps a ledger showing what's in your account. The land registry keeps a record of who owns which property. You trust the institution, and the institution vouches for the record on your behalf. That works well until it doesn't. Institutions can fail, they can freeze accounts, they can make errors, and they don't always exist in a form both sides of a transaction actually trust, particularly across borders. This is, in fact, exactly the same problem trusts were built to solve in a different way, using a trusted person instead of a shared record. Keep that parallel in mind. It will matter again when we reach the Hong Kong and trust section later on. A digital asset solves this problem differently. Instead of one institution keeping the official record, thousands of computers around the world keep an identical copy of the same record, and they continuously check each other's work. Imagine a shared notebook that millions of people around the world keep an identical copy of, and that no single person can secretly rewrite. Whoever holds the right key can prove to everyone at once that an entry in that notebook belongs to them. That in essence is a digital asset. This shared notebook is what people mean when they say blockchain. No single person can quietly go back and change a page, because everyone else's copy would immediately show the mismatch. Now here's the part that actually matters to you and your family. If there's no bank keeping the official record of who owns what, how does anyone prove that an entry in that shared notebook belongs to them? The answer is a private key. A private key is, at its simplest, an extremely long, effectively unguessable piece of information that only you should possess. Whoever holds the private key associated with an entry on that ledger can prove control over it, move it, or spend it. Nobody else can. There's a phrase you'll hear again and again in this world, and I want you to remember it because it may be the single most important idea in everything that follows. Not your keys, not your coins. If you don't control the private key, you don't actually control the asset, no matter what an app on your phone happens to show you. This brings us to a word people use loosely and honestly, a little incorrectly, a wallet. A wallet doesn't hold coins the way your physical wallet holds cash. Your digital assets aren't sitting inside your wallet at all. They're entries on the shared ledger we just described. What your wallet actually holds is your keys, and what it does is let you prove your claim on that ledger and authorize transactions. It's less a wallet and more a key ring with a signature pad attached to it. One more common confusion worth clearing up: the difference between a coin or token and the network it runs on. Bitcoin is both the name of a network, the system of computers maintaining that shared ledger, and the name of the asset that lives on that network. Other assets, often called tokens, are built to run on top of an existing network, the way an app runs on top of a phone's operating system, rather than being the phone itself. One final practical point before we move on, and I think it's the one that will genuinely change how you think about everything else in this session. When a transaction is confirmed on one of these networks, it is, for all practical purposes, irreversible. There's no customer service line to call, no chargeback, and no manager who can quietly undo an error. That isn't a flaw somebody forgot to fix. It is the entire design. The system trades away the safety net of an institution in exchange for something else entirely, a record that nobody can secretly alter and that nobody needs to trust an institution to use. So, a digital asset is an entry on a shared, tamper-resistant ledger, maintained by a network of computers rather than by a single institution. Ownership isn't a piece of paper or a bank statement. It is control of a private key. That's the core idea. Next, we get into the part I find most practically interesting, custody, and exactly what that difference means for who is really in control. So, who actually controls a digital asset day to day? This is, in my view, the single most practically important part of this entire session. Everything else builds toward decisions your family might eventually make. This is about a risk that already exists right now in however your family currently holds any digital assets, even if nobody has called it a custody arrangement. Let's start with the most direct form of holding, self-custody. This simply means you hold your own private keys without a bank or platform standing between you and the asset. Within self-custody, there are two broad approaches. A hot wallet is connected to the internet, an app on your phone or computer, convenient for regular use, but exposed to the same risks as anything else connected to a network: hacking, malware, phishing. A cold wallet is deliberately kept offline, often a small hardware device that never touches the internet except for the brief moment a transaction is signed. Self-custody puts you in complete control, and it puts the entire responsibility for safeguarding that key on you as well. There's no shared responsibility here. It's binary. A useful, if imperfect, comparison is a safe deposit box you keep in your own home rather than at a bank. Nobody else can access it, but nobody else is going to remind you where you put the key either. The alternative is exchange or third-party custody, trusting a platform to hold the keys on your behalf, the way you trust a bank to hold your deposits. You log in with a username and password, and the platform's systems handle the underlying keys entirely out of your sight. This is, understandably, the easier on-ramp for most people. But you should understand precisely what you're trading for that convenience. You no longer hold the keys. The platform does. If the platform is mismanaged, hacked, or becomes insolvent, your claim on those assets becomes a claim against the platform, not direct ownership of the asset itself. This is precisely why the phrase, "not your keys, not your coins," exists. It is a warning specifically about this arrangement, not a criticism of anyone who chooses it. For many families, that trade-off is entirely reasonable. The point is simply that it should be a conscious choice, not a default nobody examined. Whichever model your family uses, there's a single piece of information that sits behind almost every self-custody wallet, the seed phrase. This is typically a sequence of 12 to 24 ordinary words generated when the wallet is first set up that can recreate every key the wallet controls if the device is ever lost, damaged, or replaced. Think of it as the master backup and also the single point of catastrophic failure. Anyone who obtains your seed phrase can recreate your wallet and move everything in it. Anyone who loses it with no other backup loses access permanently. There is no equivalent of a bank calling to verify your identity and reset your password. The seed phrase is the whole of it. For families and institutions holding meaningful value, there's a middle path worth knowing about: multi-signature or multi-sig arrangements. Instead of a single key controlling an asset, a multi-sig setup requires a certain number of keys out of a larger set, say 2 signatures out of 3, before any transaction can go through. This means no single lost key, no single compromised device, and no single family member acting alone can move the asset. There is also a third category, sitting between self-custody and a retail exchange, professional or institutional custody. These are regulated custodians whose core business is safekeeping digital assets, typically offering insurance, audited controls, and the kind of institutional infrastructure a family office might expect from a private bank. We'll look more closely at how this fits alongside trust structures next, because this is often the custody model a trustee will actually require before agreeing to hold a digital asset at all. I want to be direct about something here, because this is the point where most people genuinely stop and reconsider how they've been thinking about digital assets. If a private key is lost, not stolen, simply lost, misplaced, forgotten, with no working backup, the asset is not frozen, not recoverable through a dispute process, and not insured by any deposit protection scheme. It is, for all practical purposes, gone. Permanently. There is no institution to call. There is no forgot password link. This isn't a design flaw anyone is working to patch. It's the deliberate trade-off we talked about earlier. And it's exactly why I'd encourage you to think of custody planning as being every bit as important as any investment decision, if not more so. Let's bring the 3 models together quickly. Self-custody gives you complete control and complete responsibility with real risk of permanent loss if handled carelessly. Exchange custody is convenient but introduces counterparty risk. Multi-sig and professional custody both reduce single points of failure at the cost of complexity or fees. None of these is automatically the right one. What matters is that your family actually knows, for any digital asset it holds, which of these 3 models applies right now, and whether that was a deliberate choice or simply what happened by default. So, custody is a different question from ownership. Self-custody means you hold the keys and bear the full responsibility. Exchange custody trades control for convenience at the cost of counterparty risk. Seed phrases are the master backup and the single point of failure. With that in mind, let's map the wider landscape of what these assets actually are before we bring in the Hong Kong connection. We've now covered custody, who actually controls a digital asset and what that means practically. Let's zoom out and answer a simpler question. What are the different kinds of digital assets actually out there? This isn't a shopping list, and it isn't investment guidance on which category to prefer. It's a map, so that the next time someone mentions a stablecoin, an NFT, or a tokenized fund, you have a general sense of what they mean. Let's start with the category most people mean when they say cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin and Ether are the best known examples. These are decentralized, non-sovereign forms of digital money. No government or central bank issues them, and no single institution controls the network they run on. This is the category most associated with volatility, and for good reason. Without a central bank managing supply, a cryptocurrency's price is set entirely by what people are willing to pay for it at any given moment. The second category solves a very different problem: stablecoins. These are tokens designed to track the value of a fiat currency, typically the US dollar, so that a holder has, in theory, an asset worth a stable, predictable amount. I say in theory deliberately, because a stablecoin is only as reliable as whatever backs it. The practical question worth asking about any stablecoin is simple. What exactly stands behind this, and who is accountable if it doesn't hold its value? The third category looks more like traditional finance, tokenized securities and funds. This is where a conventional financial instrument, a bond, a share in a fund, an interest in real estate, is represented as an entry on a blockchain rather than in a traditional register. This category tends to sit closest to existing securities regulation because, in substance, it usually is a security, just represented in a new format. The fourth category is one you've likely heard mentioned in the context of digital art, non-fungible tokens or NFTs. At its core, an NFT is a unique digital certificate of ownership. Digital art is the most publicized use case, but NFTs have also been used for event tickets, membership rights, in-game items, and ownership records for real-world items. Briefly, you may also come across the term decentralized finance, or DeFi, lending, exchange, and yield-generating arrangements that operate through code rather than a traditional bank or broker. I won't walk through the mechanics here, but it's worth having the term in your vocabulary. One more distinction, connecting back to custody, custodial versus non-custodial products. Some ways of gaining exposure to digital assets let you hold an interest in the asset's performance without ever touching a private key yourself. Others require you to hold the asset directly with all the custody considerations we discussed earlier. A family member who tells you they own crypto might mean either of these, and the difference matters enormously if something ever needs to be located, valued, or transferred as part of a succession plan. If there's one thing to take from this section, it's this: digital asset is not one asset class. It's a category containing several genuinely different things, each with its own risk profile and its own regulatory questions still being worked out. You'll also hear ongoing debate among lawyers and regulators about how some of these should be classified as a currency, a commodity, a security, or something else entirely. That debate is real and unresolved, and it's a good reason to involve a qualified professional before treating any of these categories as interchangeable in a family's planning. So, cryptocurrencies are decentralized digital money. Stablecoins track a fiat currency's value, backed by something you should always ask about. Tokenized securities represent traditional instruments in a new format. NFTs are unique digital certificates with uses beyond art, and DeFi refers to code-based arrangements without a traditional intermediary. Treating digital assets as one uniform category is probably the most common mistake people make in this space. Now that we've mapped what these assets actually are, let's bring in the Hong Kong connection, how this regulatory environment treats them, and how a trust can and can't actually hold one. Let's start with the regulatory picture here in Hong Kong. Platforms that operate as virtual asset trading venues are required to be licensed by the Securities and Futures Commission, the SFC, under a regime that combines amendments to the Anti-Money Laundering Ordinance with the pre-existing Securities and Futures Ordinance framework, together known as the dual licensing regime. In practice, this means a platform offering to trade or hold digital assets on behalf of Hong Kong clients should be able to tell you clearly and immediately whether it holds that license and under which of the two. I want to be precise about what this licensing does and doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you anything about whether an asset traded on the platform is a good investment. What it does tell you is that the platform itself has met a baseline of regulatory scrutiny around how client assets are safeguarded, how the business is run, and what happens if things go wrong. This licensing regime has developed considerably over recent years, and it continues to evolve. Treat anything I say here as a general orientation rather than a current statement of the rules. Always confirm the up-to-date position with a qualified advisor before relying on it. This is, fundamentally, a consumer protection question, not a technicality to skip past. Asking whether a platform is licensed is exactly the kind of question you'd ask about a bank or an insurer, and it deserves the same weight here. If a platform cannot answer that question plainly, that alone tells you something important. Now let's turn to the question I find genuinely most interesting because it sits squarely at the intersection of my own background in law and finance. How does a trust actually hold a digital asset? A trustee's fundamental duty is to safeguard the trust's assets prudently on behalf of the beneficiaries. That duty doesn't change because the asset happens to be a cryptocurrency instead of a share portfolio or a piece of real estate. But the practical mechanics of fulfilling it change quite a bit. Many trustees simply do not have the in-house technical capability to directly custody a private key themselves, and frankly, most shouldn't try to build that capability from scratch. What's emerged instead is a role for specialist sub-custodians, regulated institutions whose entire business is safekeeping digital assets on behalf of others, including trustees. A trustee can appoint one of these as part of fulfilling its duty, in much the same way a trustee might appoint a professional investment manager rather than picking stocks itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's genuinely different from most other assets a trust might hold. With a share portfolio, the trustee typically retains ultimate custody through a regulated bank or broker it has overseen for years. With digital assets, the trustee is often relying on a newer relationship with a custodian whose own track record may be considerably shorter, which is exactly why due diligence on that sub-custodian matters so much. Before any well-run trustee agrees to hold digital assets for a family, there are questions that need real answers. Who controls the private keys today? And will that control genuinely transfer to the trustee or its appointed custodian? Is there a properly licensed sub-custodian in place? Can the asset actually be valued and reported on a reliable, ongoing basis? Some trustees, quite reasonably, decline to hold digital assets at all because they're not prepared to take on a fiduciary duty they can't practically discharge. That's not the trustee being difficult, it's the trustee taking its obligations seriously. If your family is exploring this, expect these questions and expect that not every trustee will say yes. If you hear a trustee agree immediately with none of these questions asked, that is worth noticing too, for reasons we'll come back to before we're done today. Even once custody is settled, digital assets create a genuinely new challenge for ongoing trust administration, valuation volatility. A trustee preparing accounts or deciding on a distribution to a beneficiary needs a value for the trust fund at a given moment. For a share portfolio, that's usually straightforward. For a digital asset that can move 10 or 20% in a single day, the timing of a valuation and how it's communicated to beneficiaries becomes a real, practical question, not an academic one. A well-run trustee will generally set out in advance how and when a digital asset will be valued for these purposes, precisely so that a beneficiary isn't surprised by the answer. Digital assets also bring reporting and record-keeping obligations that look somewhat different from traditional trust assets, tracking transactions across a public ledger, reconciling custodial statements, and keeping records in a form that satisfies both the trustee's own governance standards and, increasingly, regulatory expectations around these assets. Briefly, on the regional picture, Singapore operates a parallel licensing framework through the Monetary Authority of Singapore and is frequently mentioned alongside Hong Kong as a serious jurisdiction for digital asset activity in this region. I'm not making a comparison here or suggesting one jurisdiction is preferable to the other. That's a question for your professional advisors. I simply want you aware that Hong Kong is not operating in isolation. So, In Hong Kong, virtual asset platforms should be SFC licensed, and asking about that license is a legitimate consumer protection question. A trust can hold digital assets, but a trustee's fiduciary duty means real questions need real answers first, often through a licensed sub-custodian rather than the trustee holding keys directly. And once digital assets sit inside a trust, valuation volatility and reporting genuinely change how that trust is administered day to day. That's the part of this field where I feel most at home, because it's where law, regulation, and the practical mechanics of custody all meet. Let's step back now and ask a more human question. Why do families end up holding these assets in the first place? It's rare for anyone to arrive at digital assets through a deliberate, considered family decision. It tends to happen sideways, through a son or daughter, through a business relationship, through an inheritance nobody quite planned for. This part is about understanding those pathways, because recognizing how digital assets actually enter a family's life is the first step toward managing them sensibly. Let's start with the most straightforward reason. Some people hold digital assets the same way they might hold gold or a foreign currency, as a store of value or as one small slice of a diversified portfolio. Families have used gold, property, and foreign currency for generations to spread risk across different kinds of assets. Digital assets, for some, have simply become one more line in that same diversification exercise. I'm not telling you that's a good or bad addition to a portfolio. That's an investment decision for your financial advisor, not this session. The second pathway, and probably the most common one, next generation exposure. Younger family members, often in their 20s and 30s, frequently hold digital assets entirely independently of the family's traditional wealth structures. Here's a pattern that shows up again and again. The parents or grandparents who built the family's traditional wealth have a trust, a will, a clear structure, and no idea that a younger family member is holding a meaningful position in digital assets in a wallet only that person controls. It rarely comes from secrecy. Most often it simply never comes up because nobody has framed digital assets as the kind of thing a family discusses alongside a trust or a will. The third pathway is through business. Family businesses increasingly touch digital assets in ordinary commercial ways, accepting them as payment, holding them as part of treasury management, or investing in a venture that happens to operate in this space. A fourth pathway, particularly relevant to families across Asia, cross-border value transfer. Traditional banking rails can be slow, expensive, and, in some corridors, genuinely difficult to use, particularly for families with members spread across mainland China, Hong Kong, Singapore, the UK, Australia, and North America. Digital assets offer a way to move value across these borders without relying on the same banking infrastructure. I'm describing a practical reality here, not endorsing a workaround for any regulatory or reporting obligation. Those obligations apply regardless of which rail is used to move value. Which brings us to what I'd call the succession blind spot, and it's really the thread running through everything we've just covered. Whether the exposure comes from diversification, a next-generation family member, a business, or cross-border transfer, it tends to accumulate quietly without ever being folded into the family's formal planning. And digital assets are unusually unforgiving of this kind of blind spot for the reason we covered earlier. There's no institution to call if a key is lost, and often no record at all if nobody else in the family knows the asset exists. A bank account eventually surfaces during probate because the bank knows about it. A wallet that only one person controls may never surface at all. Retail adoption of digital assets is high across Hong Kong, Singapore, and the wider region. This isn't a niche interest. And the generational gap is a genuinely regional pattern too. It is overwhelmingly the older generation setting up the trusts and succession plans, and overwhelmingly the younger generation holding the digital assets. If those two groups aren't talking to each other about this, the planning and the actual assets can drift a long way apart. One last distinction. There's a real difference between someone who holds digital assets as a long-term position and someone who actively trades. The succession and governance questions differ quite a bit between the two. Simply notice which pattern applies in your own family. So, families typically encounter digital assets through diversification, next-generation exposure, business activity, or cross-border transfer, and in nearly every case, that exposure accumulates quietly outside formal succession planning. That gap, more than any technical feature of the asset itself, is the real risk we're addressing in this session. Let's close now with the practical part, what to actually do with everything we've covered. Let's turn this into something practical, quickly. Here are the questions worth raising with a trustee, solicitor, or financial advisor. How are my digital assets actually custodied, and by whom? What happens to them if I lose access or if I die unexpectedly? Does my trustee have the capability or a named licensed sub-custodian to hold this asset? Is the platform I use licensed? How are these assets valued and reported? And perhaps most importantly, who else in my family actually knows these assets exist and knows how to access them? The mistakes I see most often: no succession plan for keys or seed phrases. Holding significant value on a platform that can't confirm its licensing status. Never telling a trustee or another family member that a digital asset exists at all. Treating a hot wallet as long-term storage, and conflating "I have an account on an exchange" with "I actually possess this asset." As we covered earlier, those are genuinely different things. Red flags worth watching for: a platform that cannot confirm its licensing status when asked directly. Any product promising guaranteed returns. Pressure to move your assets off a secure custody arrangement. And an advisor unwilling to simply say, "I don't know," when asked something they haven't encountered before. On governance: multi-signature or multi-party approval for anything significant, regular reconciliation, and a written record of what is held, where, and how it can be accessed. One last thing, and it matters more than anything else in this session. Understanding how digital assets work is not the same as being equipped to evaluate your own family's specific holdings or to replace the advice of a qualified professional. The purpose of everything we've covered is to make that conversation more productive, not to replace it. Before we close, I want to be honest about what this session has deliberately left out, because a fair amount has, and that's by design, at this level. We haven't gone deep on institutional-grade custody, multi-party computation wallets, hardware security modules, and how a family office actually evaluates a sub-custodian's controls. We haven't covered how a trust deed should actually be drafted to accommodate a digital asset, the specific clauses, trustee indemnities, and discretion mechanics that make it work in practice. We haven't touched cross-border tax and estate treatment, which gets genuinely complicated once a family spans multiple jurisdictions. And we've only briefly named DeFi without walking through how lending, yield, and smart contract risk actually work. None of that is a gap in this course. It's the natural boundary of a foundational session like this one. If any of it sounds like exactly what your family needs next, that's precisely the kind of material a more advanced course would cover. If a family member needs a specific answer about their own circumstances, that conversation belongs with a solicitor or a licensed trustee. If your family hasn't yet completed Trust 101, I'd recommend it. Much of what we covered on the Hong Kong and Trust Connection assumes a working understanding of how trusts function. And if succession planning, more broadly, is on your mind, Estate and Succession Planning 101 is a natural next step. You'll receive a certificate of attendance for completing this course. It confirms you've engaged with the material. It does not confer a professional qualification, and it isn't a substitute for the advice of a qualified solicitor, trustee, or financial advisor. Everything in this session has been for educational purposes only, and none of it constitutes legal, financial, investment, or professional advice. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this has given you a clearer, calmer picture of what's actually at stake with digital assets, and the right questions to bring to the people who can help you act on it. I'm Dr. Out. This has been Digital Asset 101. Digital Asset 101 is the original work of ETRUST Academy. Copyright 2026, MKA, Nominee Limited, all rights reserved.